North Carolina, a state which has played an important role in American history from colonial times through to present day. From the mysterious disappearance of Roanoke Colony to its leading role in the War of Independence and racial tensions through the Reconstruction era. Here, we'll explore this mid-southern state and some of its key historical moments. The state is made up of three main geographic areas: the Atlantic coastal region in the east, Piedmont region in the center, and the mountain region to the west with access to the majestic Appalachian Range. Formed by the retreat of the ocean some 125 million years ago, these distinct geographic zones made it an attractive region for settlement with rich and varied natural landscapes. This occurred at the latest by around 12,000 years ago, with these early nomadic Paleo-Indian groups eventually giving way to the more settled forest cultures. These groups were also found through Georgia to the south, right up to Illinois and New York State in the north. The influential Mississippian culture would dominate the central Piedmont region for centuries, with a complex trade network stretching from around the Gulf of Mexico to the modern Canadian border region. The first European explorer to reach North Carolina was Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524, an Italian in the employ of the French monarch Francis I. This was an emerging age of competition between European powers for spoils in the New World, and the race was on to establish trade routes and early mapping. As with other expeditions in this period, another important motivation was to find a sea route to China and the East more generally, with Verrazzano himself tasked with this. After a testing voyage and loss of multiple ships, he approached the area of Cape Fear off North Carolina's coast before proceeding north to Pamlico Sound. In his subsequent letter back to his patron, King Francis, he declares that the lagoon is in fact the entry to the Pacific Ocean and their much-desired route to China. As later exploration would show, this was in fact the start of over 2,000 miles of landmass. A period of limited European activity followed until 1584, when the first English settlers would arrive. This marked an early period of British exploration, well before the later East Coast colonies. In 1585, a settlement was founded which lasted no longer than a year. This was followed in 1587 by John White's founding of the now infamous settlement at Roanoke. When White returned 3 years later with supplies, there was no trace of the settlers, all seemingly having vanished. This marks the start of a centuries-long enigma regarding the lost colony, which would establish itself in state mythology. Whether absorbed into local tribal groups such as the Tuscarora or lost to disease, it remains unclear. Regardless, the ill-fated Roanoke colony would come to symbolize earlier settler ambition and determination. Around the early 1600s, English settlers from Virginia started moving south into the Albemarle Sound region of North Carolina, increasing the population. This was followed soon after by a charter in 1663 from King Charles II of England. With this, he established a new colony called Carolina, with a name in honor of his father, Charles I. Due to governance issues, this larger colony split in 1712 into North Carolina and South Carolina, with the North becoming an official Crown colony in 1729. The early 1700s also saw the first significant conflicts between natives and Europeans in the state, who had, for the 50 years previously, largely been living in peace. However, increased European settlement west and into traditional Tuscarora homelands brought more competition and tension, particularly the founding of New Bern by John Lawson. It was, in fact, the revenge murder of John Lawson which would provide the final spark to ignite the conflict in 1711. The Tuscarora War would continue for over another 3 years, with the tribe ultimately giving way to the militia's superior firepower. Following the conflict, the Tuscarora moved en masse northwards to the New York state region, where they would join the Iroquois Five Nations. The war helped clear out a large number of natives from the colony, and in a knock-on effect, also led to drastic changes in the burgeoning slave trade. Previously, natives had been prized for their use as slaves, captured and sold on by settlers of the region. However, with Tuscarora's migration and general decline in native numbers through European-spread disease, the slave trade became focused more exclusively on Africans. This led to a growth in demand for their import, which helped fuel the transatlantic slave trade over the next period. More than 80% of the roughly 12.5 million people in total transported from Africa were taken on the voyage from 1700 onward, with 1720 to 1780 being the maximum flow years. North Carolina would remain a relatively poor colony through the period, especially in contrast to its neighbor, Virginia. It lacked the deep water ports as seen in Norfolk, Virginia, which limited crucial import and export of goods by sea. Edenton served as state capital from 1722, followed by New Bern from 1766, with Raleigh finally chosen in 1788. It was named in honor of English explorer Walter Raleigh, who had also been a sponsor of the infamous Roanoke colony. North Carolina would go on to play an important role in the Revolutionary War soon to unfold across the colonies. It was an early mover in the struggle for independence, with the Halifax Resolves of 1776 passed by the colony's Provincial Congress, which instructed delegates to vote for independence. It was regarded as a patriot stronghold and provided around 7,800 recruits to the Continental Army and a further 10,000 men to local militia units. The significant early Battle of Moores Creek Bridge would occur in North Carolina. Here, Loyalist forces met with a well-equipped Patriot militia and were forced into retreat following a deadly effort to cross the river. British commanders McLeod and Campbell were cut down in a hail of musket and artillery fire as they attempted to lead their men across the small bridge, which Patriot forces had zeroed in. Following the barrage, the remaining British troops pulled back, with as many as 850 taken captive by American forces in the following days. The battle, while small in scale, marked a turning point for British influence in the region and also reduced its ability to recruit from the remaining Loyalist population. The southern campaign of the war also played out here, including Cornwallis's 1780 to 1781 march. British and Continental forces would meet in a significant clash at the Battle of Guilford Court House. The battle was large in scale for the war, with around 4,500 US troops facing 2,500 British. And though on paper a Loyalist victory, with American troops retreating south, British losses were heavy, and their general combat capability weakened as a result. Cornwallis's decision to march to Virginia following the battle would also set final events in motion towards an American victory in the war, with his troops' subsequent defeat and surrender at Yorktown. In the aftermath of the war, North Carolina delegates would initially vote against ratifying the U.S. Constitution in 1788, wary of the power granted to federal over state authority. However, in 1789 they met again, this time ratifying it and becoming the 12th state to do so. During the period of early nationhood, North Carolina developed relatively slowly. It did become a pioneer in education, though, with the University of North Carolina opening in 1795, the first public university to admit students in the nation. An increasing reliance on slave labor in the Central and Coastal Plains region produced tobacco and cotton, which were the state's main exports. Despite a significant population of free blacks in the frontier regions, who for the previous period had enjoyed some rights following Nat Turner's famous slave rebellion in Virginia to the north, these rights were removed in 1835 by the state legislature. The views of lawmakers contrasted sharply with the state's Quaker and Mennonite Christian populations who strongly opposed slavery and would help make North Carolina an important point on the Underground Railroad network for enslaved blacks fleeing north. By the mid-19th century, the state would gradually see more infrastructure development, with the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad opened in 1840 connecting the two important cities. It was the longest stretch of track in the world at the time and would also play an important role in supplying the Confederacy in the Civil War, which was soon to erupt. Despite the flurry of development, though, this was still a state heavily reliant on slave-based agriculture. As of the 1860 census, nearly a third of the state's 990,000 inhabitants were slaves. Yet despite this, North Carolina was the last state to secede on May 20, 1861, and only did so when commanded by Lincoln to invade their neighbor, South Carolina. A total of around 30,000 men from North Carolina died during the war, the vast majority fighting for the Confederacy. A series of smaller clashes occurred on state territory through the earlier phases of the conflict, but the largest and most significant would occur in 1865 at the Battle of Bentonville. Here, a fairly desperate Confederate army attempted to halt Sherman's Union advance through the Carolinas. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, Confederate troops would nevertheless maintain the battle for nearly 3 days. With over 2,600 casualties, though, and in face of clear Union numerical superiority, Johnston would surrender soon after. Here at Bennett Place, nearly 90,000 of his men put down their arms, marking the effective end of Confederate fighting capability. During the Reconstruction era, which followed the war, North Carolina experienced a period of heightened tensions, similar to neighbors Georgia and Tennessee. Much of this was due to the abolition of slavery and new social status of African Americans within Southern communities. Through lynchings, intimidation on polling days, and restrictive legislation, post-Civil War black rights had been extinguished by 1900. Jim Crow laws would remain in place until the 1960s and maintain North Carolina as a two-tier segregated society, although likely less rigid a system than seen in the Deep South, such as Mississippi and Georgia. The state remained largely agricultural through the next decades, with tobacco and cotton key crops. These were accompanied by a growing textile industry too, though, especially in the Piedmont region. This helped diversify the economy and add value within the state to the cotton, which would otherwise have been exported as a less valuable raw material. North Carolina had also become known as a furniture-making capital, with the area around High Point a hugely productive hub. In fact, by the 1950s, an estimated 60% of the nation's furniture was produced within 100 miles of the city. The Great Depression and collapsing demand for agricultural products which followed wrought havoc in North Carolina. However, Roosevelt's targeted tobacco and cotton relief packages were effective, as was World War II, at providing a significant statewide boost to the economy. This included huge demand for North Carolina's respected textiles, with the state supplying the U.S. Army with more textile products than any other through the course of the war. The build-out of military infrastructure and training centers, particularly at Fort Bragg, also had knock-on economic benefits for the state. It's estimated that between 1939 and 1941, around $44 million was spent on the development of the base, which by the end of the war would house over 100,000 soldiers. Post-war and infrastructure build-out continued, as well as statewide electrification, with many homes brought onto the grid during the period. Whether due to the state's historic free black population of the post-Revolutionary War era or its role in the Underground Railroad network, North Carolina would become an important location for the civil rights movement, which transformed America through the late 1950s and 1960s. The college sit-in movement began in Greensboro, where African American students attempted to sit in and receive service in the white-only eating area of a Woolworth store. This generated huge pushback and often violence at the hands of those in favor of segregation. However, it ignited a movement which would spread across the South, ultimately leading to the emergence of figures like Martin Luther King and later marches. The state, along with its southern neighbors, would eventually be forced to desegregate by legislation in 1964 and 1965. Though a gradual process, it marked a point of no return for the Jim Crow laws, which had remained in place almost since the end of the Civil War. As the 20th century progressed, the traditional industries of tobacco, cotton, and textiles would see a decline in response to new global trends and mechanization in farming. Helping to soften the blow was the growth of the finance industry in particular, with Charlotte becoming the largest financial center outside New York. This reflected the broader growth of a pro-business environment, putting it among the top U.S. states in many measures of this metric. The population of key cities has continued to grow, and the higher education sector, which the state invested heavily in earlier in the century, consistently attracts talent. This strong education legacy also contributed to the establishment of the important Research Triangle Park in 1959, which remains the largest of its kind in the U.S. Other growth industries included pharmaceuticals, food processing, and the vehicle parts industry. All these factors helped the state economy diversify after being so heavily reliant on agriculture for most of its history. North Carolina has seen its share of pivotal historical moments over the centuries, exhibiting a spirit of resistance and determination which can be seen early in settlements such as at Roanoke, or in its eagerness for independence from Great Britain and as a hub of patriot sentiment. A state of contradictions, too, with the embrace of slavery by many wealthier elements of society, contrasting against the ethics-based approach of its Quakers and Mennonite Christians. Through post-Civil War racial tension and a 20th century transformation of its economy, North Carolina ultimately emerged as a diverse and dynamic state. If you'd like to help us keep creating and get early access to our videos, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or joining us on Patreon. Every bit of support helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching.